Right now, BTS is a name that shakes stadiums across 5 continents, a group that has shattered every record the music industry thought was unbreakable, from Billboard Hot 100 number ones to selling out Wembley Stadium in minutes, not hours. Minutes. But here's the thing most people forget, or maybe never even knew in the first place. Before the private jets, before the United Nations speeches, before Dynamite lit up every chart on the planet, these 7 guys from a tiny, almost bankrupt entertainment company were fighting battles that would have made most people quit on day one. We're talking real, raw, gut-wrenching struggles that don't get talked about enough. Did you know one member almost got kicked out of the group just weeks before debut? Can you guess which member was so broke he had to choose between eating lunch or taking the bus to practice? What if I told you one of them was told by his own family that chasing music was a waste of his life? And here's the wildest part. One member wasn't even supposed to be in BTS at all. He walked into that building for a completely different reason. Sounds unreal, right? Well, buckle up, because every single one of these is a documented, verified fact. This is not fan fiction. This is history. From poverty to prejudice, from self-doubt to near-elimination, these are the 7 struggles that almost erased BTS before the world ever got the chance to know them. We're counting down from number 7 all the way to number 1, and trust me, the deeper we go, the harder these stories hit. So, are you ready? Let's get into it. Number 7. Jimin. The boy who was never sure he'd make it to the stage. Let's start this countdown with someone whose smile could light up an entire arena, someone who moves on stage like gravity personally decided to give him a free pass, Park Jimin. But here's what most people don't realize when they watch Jimin glide across that stage with jaw-dropping precision and effortless charisma. This guy spent nearly every single day before BTS's debut genuinely believing he was about to get cut from the group. And no, that's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. That's straight from Jimin's own mouth, confirmed in multiple interviews, documentaries, and the members themselves backing it up. See, Jimin was the last member added to the BTS lineup. While guys like RM, Suga, and J-Hope had been training at Big Hit Entertainment for 2, even 3 years, Jimin didn't officially join until 2012, barely a year before the group's debut on June 13, 2013. That alone put him in an incredibly vulnerable position. He was the newcomer, the late arrival, the one who had to prove himself twice as hard in half the time. And the pressure? It was absolutely suffocating. Before Big Hit, Jimin was living in Busan, the 2nd largest city in South Korea, attending the Busan High School of Arts, where he was majoring in contemporary dance. And he wasn't just any student. He was admitted as the number 1 top-ranked student in the modern dance department. Let that sink in for a moment. This kid was already a prodigy in his own lane. His teachers adored him, his future in contemporary dance was practically guaranteed, and he had a stable, predictable path ahead of him. But then, one audition changed everything. When Big Hit Entertainment held auditions, Jimin's dance teacher actually recommended he try out, and he passed. The catch? Accepting meant leaving behind everything he knew. He transferred from Busan Arts High to Korea Arts High School in Seoul, hundreds of kilometers away from his family, his friends, and the comfort zone he'd built his entire young life around. He was a teenager making an adult-sized gamble, and the odds were not in his favor. When he arrived at Big Hit's training facility, the culture shock was immediate and brutal. Jimin was a contemporary dancer, fluid, graceful, emotional in movement. BTS was being built as a hip-hop group. The other trainees were rapping, freestyling, breathing street culture. Jimin walked into a room full of guys who had been grinding in a completely different musical universe, and he had to adapt fast or face elimination. And Big Hit was not running a charity. The company was small, financially struggling, and every trainee slot was precious. There was no room for someone who couldn't keep up. According to multiple accounts, including from the members themselves in the Burn the Stage documentary series, Jimin was placed on what was essentially a probationary evaluation, meaning the company hadn't fully committed to him being in the final lineup. He was being watched, tested, judged constantly. Every practice session felt like an audition. Every evaluation felt like it could be his last day. Now imagine the psychological weight of that. You're 16, 17 years old. You've left your family behind. You've abandoned a guaranteed future in dance. And every single morning you wake up not knowing if today is the day someone taps you on the shoulder and says, "Pack your bags." Jimin has spoken openly about crying almost every night during this period. He talked about lying in the trainee dorm, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. The self-doubt was relentless. He would watch the other members, RM with his genius-level lyricism, Suga with his fire on the mic, J-Hope with his insane dance skills, and think, what do I even bring to this group? But here's where it gets even darker, and this is the part that genuinely breaks people's hearts when they first learn about it. Jimin developed an extremely unhealthy relationship with food during this pre-debut period, one that would haunt him well into BTS's early career. He became obsessed with the idea that his body wasn't right, that he was too short, that his face was too round, that he didn't look like what a K-pop idol was supposed to look like. He started skipping meals, not occasionally, but systematically. There are accounts, confirmed by Jimin himself and corroborated by the other members, of him going entire days without eating. In Burn the Stage, he admitted to periods of extreme fasting where he would eat only one meal in an entire day, sometimes pushing it even further. The other members, especially Jin and Jungkook, have talked about how they would literally try to force Jimin to eat, how they'd bring food to his room, how they'd beg him to take care of himself. Jungkook, who was the youngest and looked up to Jimin enormously, once described watching Jimin nearly faint during practice and feeling completely helpless. The physical toll was real. Jimin would get dizzy during choreography, his energy levels crashed constantly, and yet he still pushed himself harder than anyone else in the room because in his mind, he was always one bad evaluation away from being sent home. What makes Jimin's story so powerful from an analytical standpoint is the intersection of multiple pressures that most people never consider. He wasn't just dealing with trainee stress, he was dealing with body image issues amplified by an industry that is notoriously brutal about physical appearance, isolation from his family at an age when most kids are still figuring out basic life skills, the imposter syndrome of being the last one added to a group of guys who already had chemistry and history together, and the existential fear of having sacrificed a sure future for a dream that might evaporate any day. Most adults would crack under one of those pressures. Jimin was carrying all of them simultaneously as a teenager. And yet, and this is the part that makes Jimin's chapter in BTS history so remarkable, he didn't quit. He didn't fold. He took every criticism, every evaluation, every sleepless night, and channeled it into becoming one of the most captivating performers in modern pop music history. His contemporary dance background, the very thing that made him feel like an outsider in a hip-hop group, ended up becoming one of BTS's greatest visual weapons. When Jimin dances, you see something the other members don't have, a fluidity, an emotional expressiveness rooted in modern dance technique that adds an entirely different texture to BTS's performances. He turned his biggest insecurity into his biggest superpower. Today, Park Jimin is a solo chart-topping artist, a fashion icon, and someone whose stage presence has been praised by professional dancers, choreographers, and critics worldwide. But none of that was guaranteed. None of that was handed to him. He clawed his way into BTS with bleeding fingernails and tear-stained cheeks, and every time you see him smile on that stage, just remember, that smile was earned through a level of suffering most fans can barely imagine. But if you think showing up last and fighting to survive the lineup is a tough story, wait until you hear what the next member on our list went through, because number 6 didn't just struggle with doubt. This person faced a wall of resistance from the people who were supposed to support him the most. Stay locked in. Number 6. Suga, the underground ghost who almost chose silence over stardom. Yoongi. Before the world knew him as Suga, before August D became one of the most critically acclaimed solo projects in K-pop history, before his production credits stretched across global hits worth billions of streams, there was a skinny, pale-faced kid from Daegu who couldn't afford to eat and make music at the same time, so he chose music and went hungry. That's not poetic license. That's literally what happened. And the full story is so much heavier than most people realize. Yoongi grew up in the Buk district of Daegu, South Korea's fourth largest city, but a place that felt worlds away from the glittering entertainment industry of Seoul. His family was working class, and not the comfortable working class that some idols politely reference in interviews to seem relatable. No, the Min family genuinely struggled financially. His father worked long hours, his mother did the same, and money was always tight. There was no surplus, no safety net, no let's invest in our son's artistic dream fund sitting in a bank account somewhere. In that household, survival came first, and dreams were a luxury the family budget simply couldn't accommodate. So when a teenage Yoongi started falling in love with hip-hop and rap music, when he began spending every free moment writing lyrics in notebooks and studying the flow patterns of Epic High, Nas, and Eminem, his parents didn't see a future. They saw a crisis. They saw their son drifting away from academics, away from the kind of stable career path that could pull the family out of financial stress, and toward an industry that chewed up and spit out thousands of hopefuls every single year. The resistance from his family wasn't casual disapproval or a few concerned conversations over dinner. It was a genuine, sustained conflict that created deep emotional wounds Yoongi would carry for years. His parents wanted him to study. They wanted a doctor, an engineer, a government worker, anything with a predictable paycheck and a pension. Music? Rapping? That wasn't a career in their eyes. That was a hobby at best, a delusion at worst. And in Korean family culture, where filial piety and parental respect carry enormous cultural weight, going against your parents' wishes isn't just rebellious, it feels like betrayal. Yoongi was essentially being forced to choose between the people he loved most and the only thing that made him feel alive. But Yoongi chose music anyway, and the cost was immediate. By his early teens, he had discovered Daegu's underground rap scene, a raw, unpolished community of artists who performed in small clubs, traded beats on cheap equipment, and lived for the art in a way that mainstream K-pop never could. Yoongi adopted the stage name Gloss and started building a reputation as a lyricist with a razor-sharp tongue and an emotional depth that most underground rappers twice his age couldn't match. He wasn't just rhyming words, he was dissecting his pain, his anger, his loneliness, and laying it bare over beats. He produced himself on equipment so outdated it would make a modern bedroom producer cringe. But underground respect doesn't pay rent. To fund his music and survive day to day, Yoongi took on multiple part-time jobs, and this is where the story takes a turn that still makes fans go quiet when they hear it for the first time. One of his jobs was as a delivery rider, pedaling through the streets of Daegu on a bicycle to drop off orders. The pay was minimal, the hours were brutal, and the work was physically demanding for a kid who was already sleep-deprived from late-night studio sessions. And then came the accident. While making a delivery, Yoongi was struck by a car. The impact threw him off his bicycle and slammed him into the pavement. He injured his shoulder badly. We're talking potential ligament and joint damage that would require medical attention, rest, and rehabilitation. For most people, the logical next step would have been to go to a hospital, get properly treated, take time off, heal. But Yoongi couldn't afford the medical bills. Let that sit with you for a second. A teenager, injured in a traffic accident while working a job he only had because he needed money to chase a dream his family didn't support, couldn't afford to get his body fixed. So what did he do? He hid it. He wrapped up his shoulder, gritted his teeth, and kept going. He kept working, kept writing, kept performing in underground shows, all while carrying an injury that sent shooting pain through his body every time he moved his arm. That shoulder injury, by the way, would follow him all the way into BTS and eventually require surgery years later, a delayed consequence of poverty forcing a young man to choose between healing and surviving. Now here's the part of Yoongi's story that adds an entirely different layer to understanding who he is. When Big Hit Entertainment held auditions, Yoongi didn't walk in wanting to be an idol. He had zero interest in the choreography, the fan service, the polished image manufacturing that defines K-pop stardom. He auditioned because Big Hit was advertising for producers. Yoongi wanted to make beats, write songs, work behind the scenes. He wanted to be the invisible architect, not the face on the poster. But Bang Si-hyuk, Big Hit's founder, saw something in Yoongi that went beyond production skills. He saw a performer reluctant, resistant, but undeniably magnetic. And so Yoongi was brought in not as a behind-the-scenes producer, but as a trainee for an upcoming idol group. Imagine the internal conflict. Here's a guy who built his identity in the raw, authentic underground rap scene, a world that actively looked down on manufactured K-pop idols as sellouts and corporate puppets. And now he was being asked to become the very thing his community despised. Joining an idol group meant learning choreography he didn't care about, maintaining a visual image he found superficial, and potentially losing every ounce of credibility he'd built in the underground. Some of his fellow underground rappers did, in fact, mock him for it. The transition from Gloss to Suga wasn't just a name change, it was an identity crisis that forced Yoongi to question everything he believed about artistry, authenticity, and what it means to be a real musician. During his trainee days at Big Hit, the financial nightmare didn't magically disappear. Big Hit Entertainment in 2010, 2011, 2012 was not the powerhouse corporation it is today. It was a small, struggling company that had essentially bet everything on one previous group that didn't achieve the expected success. Resources were thin, trainee stipends were practically non-existent, and conditions were cramped. Yoongi has spoken in interviews and in his own music, most notably in his mixtape track, The Last, about the mental health battles he fought during this period. Depression, social anxiety, obsessive-compulsive tendencies. He described days where getting out of bed felt like lifting a mountain, where the gap between his dreams and his reality felt so vast that the darkness almost swallowed him whole. In The Last, he raps with a rawness that strips away every layer of idol polish. He talks about visiting a psychiatrist, about being prescribed medication, about the stigma of mental illness in Korean society, making him feel like admitting he needed help was its own kind of failure. This was years before mental health became an openly discussed topic in K-pop. Yoongi was breaking that silence when it could have genuinely cost him his career. What makes Suga's pre-fame struggle analytically fascinating is the sheer number of identities he had to reconcile. He was an underground purist forced into a pop machine. A son who defied his family's wishes and carried that guilt silently. A broke teenager who literally chose between bus fare and lunch. He's confirmed in a fan meeting that there were days he walked to practice because he spent his last coins on a single kimbap roll. An injured worker who hid his pain because the system gave him no other option. And a young man battling clinical depression in a culture that told him to simply try harder and stop being weak. Each one of those battles alone could fill a documentary. Yoongi fought all of them simultaneously, and he did it while writing lyrics so brutally honest that they would eventually resonate with millions of people fighting their own invisible wars. Today, Min Yoongi stands as one of the most respected producer artists in global music, someone who has worked with the likes of Halsey, Juice WRLD, and Max, someone whose solo work as August D has outsold and outcharted entire groups. But every bar he writes, every beat he produces, every time he stands on a stage he never originally wanted to be on, it all traces back to a broken bicycle on a Daegu street, an empty stomach, and a kid who refused to let the world decide his ceiling. Now, if Suga's story left you thinking that financial hardship was the worst thing a BTS member could face before debut, number 5 is about to challenge that assumption entirely, because the next member on this list didn't just struggle with money or doubt. They battled something far more personal, something that hit right at the core of who they were. You're not ready for this one. Number 5, Jungkook, the child who traded his entire childhood for a dream he couldn't even fully understand. Most people discover their life's purpose in their 20s, maybe their 30s, maybe never at all. Jungkook was 13. Not 13 like young teenager starting to think about the future, 13 like still in middle school, voice hasn't fully changed, barely tall enough to reach the top shelf, 13. And at that age, while other kids in Busan were worrying about homework, playing video games after school, and having their first awkward crushes, Jungkook made a decision that would strip away every single normal experience a teenager is supposed to have. He packed a bag, said goodbye to his parents, left the only city he'd ever known, and moved to Seoul completely alone to become a trainee at a small entertainment company most people had never heard of. 13 years old. Alone. In a massive city. Chasing a dream so enormous and uncertain that even adults with decades of experience fail at it every single day. That's not inspirational, that's terrifying. And the full weight of what Jungkook sacrificed and endured during those formative years is something that deserves far more attention than it typically gets. Let's rewind to how it all started. In 2011, a wide-eyed kid from Busan's Mandeok neighborhood auditioned for Superstar K Season 3, one of South Korea's biggest televised talent competitions. Think American Idol, but with an even more ruthless elimination rate. Jungkook performed, gave it everything he had, and didn't make it. He was eliminated in the early rounds. For most 13-year-olds, that kind of public rejection would be the end of the story. You'd cry, your parents would comfort you, and life would resume its normal trajectory. But something unusual happened after Jungkook's Superstar K appearance. Despite not advancing on the show, his raw potential caught the eyes of entertainment industry scouts watching the auditions. Not one, not two, but 7 different entertainment companies reached out to him with casting offers. 7. Among them were some of the biggest names in the K-pop industry, companies with established artists, massive budgets, and proven track records of producing stars. Any rational person would have looked at those 7 offers and picked the safest, most established option. Jungkook picked Big Hit Entertainment, at the time, arguably the least proven company on the list. Why? Because he watched a trainee named Kim Namjoon rap. That's it. Jungkook saw RM perform during his audition visit to Big Hit and was so captivated by his charisma, his intensity, his sheer presence, that a 13-year-old kid made a life-altering decision based on a gut feeling about a person he hadn't even spoken to yet. The boldness of that choice is staggering in hindsight, but at the time, plenty of people, industry insiders, even some of Jungkook's own acquaintances, thought he'd made a terrible mistake. Big Hit was small, underfunded, and had no guarantee of producing a successful group. Choosing it over established powerhouses was, by every conventional metric, irrational. But Jungkook's challenges didn't start with picking the wrong company. They started the moment he physically arrived in Seoul. Picture this. A barely teenage boy from a mid-sized coastal city walking into a trainee dormitory in the capital, surrounded by older boys, some of them 4, 5, even 6 years his senior, all of whom had already built friendships, inside jokes, and training routines together. Jungkook wasn't just the new kid. He was a child among young adults. And his response to that overwhelming environment wasn't what you might expect from someone who would eventually become one of the most electrifying performers on the planet. He shut down. Completely. Multiple BTS members have described the early Jungkook as almost painfully shy. Not cute introvert, shy, genuinely, deeply withdrawn to the point where it worried the people around him. J-Hope has recalled in interviews that Jungkook would barely make eye contact during the first weeks. Suga described a kid who would answer questions with one-word responses and then immediately retreat into silence. Namjoon, the very person whose charisma drew Jungkook to Big Hit, noticed that this incredibly talented young boy seemed almost afraid to exist in the same space as everyone else. The shyness wasn't just social discomfort. It was rooted in something much more fundamental. Jungkook was homesick to a degree that's hard for people who haven't experienced displacement at that age to fully comprehend. He missed his parents. He missed his older brother. He missed the familiar streets of Busan, the sound of the ocean, the comfort of sleeping in his own bed knowing his family was right down the hall. He's spoken about crying at night in the dormitory, turning his face to the wall so the older trainees wouldn't see. Imagine being so young that your body is still literally growing, your brain is still developing, your emotional toolkit is still being assembled, and you're expected to function in a high-pressure professional environment hundreds of kilometers away from every source of safety and comfort you've ever known. The other BTS members recognized what was happening, and what followed is one of the most quietly beautiful chapters in the group's history. They didn't just treat Jungkook as a fellow trainee, they essentially became his surrogate family. Jin, the oldest, took on an almost parental role, making sure Jungkook ate properly, slept enough, and didn't bottle up his emotions until they exploded. Jimin, despite being only 2 years older and fighting his own battles with self-doubt, became a protective older brother figure who could coax Jungkook out of his shell with patience and warmth. The Hyung line, the older members, collectively understood that this kid needed more than choreography corrections and vocal coaching. He needed to feel like he belonged somewhere, because the belonging he'd known his entire life had been ripped away. But here's the aspect of Jungkook's struggle that cuts deepest when you really sit with it. He didn't just leave home early. He lost his adolescence entirely. There was no normal high school experience. No hanging out with school friends after class. No weekend trips to the arcade or the movies. No lazy summer vacations. No figuring out who you are through the messy, unstructured trial and error that defines the teenage years for most human beings. Instead, Jungkook's teenage years were consumed by a relentless cycle of vocal training, dance practice, physical conditioning, language lessons, and evaluations, all governed by schedules he didn't set and standards he didn't create. While other 15-year-olds were experiencing their first taste of independence, Jungkook's independence had been replaced by institutional structure. His free time was measured in minutes, not hours. His social circle was limited to 6 older guys and a handful of company staff. His concept of normal had been fundamentally rewired before he was old enough to drive. And the training itself was physically grueling for a body that was still developing. Jungkook was learning complex choreography designed for adult performers, pushing his muscles and joints to limits that sports medicine experts would flag as risky for someone his age. He was training his voice through intensive sessions that demanded control and power from vocal cords that were still maturing. The company eventually sent him to Los Angeles for additional dance training alone, in a foreign country at 15, unable to speak the language fluently, navigating a city notorious for being difficult even for adults who've lived there for years. The LA trip is often framed in fan narratives as this exciting adventure, but strip away the romanticization, and what you have is a 15-year-old Korean boy in a sprawling, unfamiliar American city, separated from every support system he had, expected to absorb advanced dance techniques and return home improved. The loneliness during that period was something Jungkook has hinted at in interviews, but never fully elaborated on, and maybe that silence says more than words ever could. What makes Jungkook's pre-debut story so analytically significant isn't just the individual hardships, it's the cumulative developmental cost. Psychologists and child development researchers consistently emphasize that the ages between 13 and 18 are critical for identity formation, emotional regulation, social skill development, and the establishment of personal autonomy. So you've heard about a teenager who gave up his childhood and moved to a strange city alone at 13. Heartbreaking, right? But number 4 on this list takes the concept of sacrifice to an entirely different dimension, because this member didn't just struggle before debut. They carried a secret burden so heavy that even the other members didn't fully understand it until years later. Keep watching. Number 4, RM. The genius who had to burn down his own future to build one nobody believed in. 148. That's Kim Namjoon's verified IQ score. To put that in perspective, that places him in the top 0.1% of cognitive ability in the general population, a level that psychometric researchers classify as gifted bordering on highly gifted. In South Korea, a country where academic achievement isn't just valued, but practically worshipped as the golden ticket to social mobility, financial security, and family honor. A kid with an IQ of 148 is treated like a national resource. Teachers fight to mentor you. Schools recruit you. Parents plan your trajectory towards Seoul National University, Korea University, or Yonsei, the so-called sky universities that open every door in Korean professional society. Namjoon had that trajectory laid out in front of him like a red carpet. His grades were consistently in the top 1% of the nation. His language aptitude was extraordinary, He taught himself conversational English not through expensive tutors or international schools, but by obsessively watching the American sitcom Friends with Korean subtitles, then without subtitles, rewinding scenes dozens of times until the grammar, idioms, and pronunciation embedded themselves into his neural pathways. He wasn't just book smart. He was the kind of intellectually curious mind that elite universities specifically design scholarship programs to attract. And all of that, every test score, every academic accolade, every projected path toward a prestigious career, he threw into a fire and walked away from it. For rap. For hip-hop. For an art form that Korean mainstream society in the late 2000s still largely dismissed as noise made by rebellious kids with no real future. The magnitude of what Namjoon sacrificed becomes even more staggering when you understand the cultural pressure cooker he was operating inside. In Korean family and social dynamics, your parents' expectations aren't suggestions, they carry the weight of generational duty. Namjoon's parents, like Suga's, did not initially support his musical ambitions. But unlike Suga's working-class background where the resistance was rooted in financial survival, Namjoon's parents pushed back from a place of bewildered frustration. Their son had been given a golden brain, a once-in-a-generation intellectual gift, and he was choosing to waste it on underground rap battles and Hongdae clubs. The family arguments were intense. Namjoon has alluded to them in interviews and through his music, the guilt of disappointing parents who genuinely believed they were watching their son self-destruct, the loneliness of having a vision for your life that the people closest to you simply cannot see, the exhausting cycle of defending a dream that everyone around you treats as a phase you'll eventually outgrow. His mother reportedly cried when she learned the full extent of his involvement in the underground scene. His father went through a period of refusing to discuss the subject entirely. For a Korean son who deeply loved and respected his parents, that silence was louder than any argument. Before Big Hit, Namjoon was already making waves in Seoul's underground hip-hop community under the name Runch Randa. And he wasn't some peripheral figure. He was gaining genuine respect from established underground artists. He collaborated with Zico, who would later lead Block B, and he caught the attention of rapper Sleepy from the hip-hop crew Untouchable. His lyrical ability was undeniable, not just technically proficient, but philosophically dense, layered with references to literature, sociology, and personal introspection that made him stand out in a scene often dominated by braggadocio and surface-level flexing. When Bang Si-hyuk, the founder of Big Hit Entertainment, saw Namjoon perform, the decision was immediate. Namjoon became the first recruit for what would eventually become BTS. Not the first member to audition, the first member chosen. The entire group, the entire concept, the entire vision of what BTS would become was architecturally built around Kim Namjoon. Let that weight settle in for a moment. Every other member who joined did so knowing Namjoon was already there, already the anchor point. Which means from day one, before he'd even turned 18, Namjoon was carrying a burden that would crush most industry veterans. He wasn't just a trainee working toward debut. He was the foundation. If he cracked, the entire structure collapsed. And the structure nearly collapsed multiple times. Here's a part of BTS's pre-debut history that doesn't get enough attention. The trainee lineup before the final 7 was locked in was a revolving door of heartbreak. Members came and members left. Some were cut by the company. Some quit voluntarily. Some simply disappeared one day without explanation. The original concept for the group went through radical transformations. At various points, BTS was imagined as a pure hip-hop crew, then a more conventional idol group, then something in between. Through every single iteration, every concept shift, every member departure, one person remained constant, Namjoon. Now imagine what that does to a teenager psychologically. You bond with fellow trainees, you eat with them, practice with them, share dormitory rooms with them, dream together about the future. And then one morning, a bed is empty. Someone's locker is cleaned out. A face you saw every day just isn't there anymore, and nobody talks about it because acknowledging departures forces everyone to confront the possibility that they could be next. Except Namjoon couldn't be next, because without him, there was no group. So he sat with every departure, absorbed every loss, grieved every fractured friendship, and still showed up to practice the next day ready to lead people he might lose tomorrow. The emotional toll of being the immovable center while everything around you is in constant flux, that's a psychological weight that's difficult to even articulate, let alone carry at 17, 18 years old. And then came the betrayal from his own community. When word spread through Seoul's underground hip-hop circles that Runch Randa was joining an idol group, not a hip-hop crew, not an independent project, but a manufactured K-pop group under an entertainment company, the backlash was savage. Underground hip-hop culture in Korea during that era was fiercely anti-establishment. Idol groups were seen as corporate products, assembly line performers who lip-synced and danced to music written by committees. For an underground rapper with Namjoon's credibility to cross that line was viewed not as a career move, but as a moral failing. Former collaborators distanced themselves. Online forums that had praised his lyricism now mocked his decision. People he considered friends and artistic allies publicly questioned his authenticity. The word sellout followed him like a shadow, and in a community where authenticity is the only currency that matters, being labeled a sellout was equivalent to professional execution. Namjoon has spoken about this period with remarkable honesty in later interviews and in his solo music. The track Due from his first mixtape directly addresses the identity crisis, the suffocating tension between staying true to his underground roots and embracing a new path that the purists would never forgive. He rapped about doubting himself, about late nights questioning whether he'd made the right call, about the specific sting of being judged by people whose opinions he once valued more than anyone else's. This wasn't a generic, haters gonna hate narrative. This was a young man watching a community he loved and identified with reject him in real time and having to find the internal strength to keep walking forward anyway. But perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of Namjoon's pre-debut struggle is the leadership burden that was placed on shoulders far too young to carry it. When the final 7 members of BTS were assembled, Namjoon was designated the leader. Not because he campaigned for the role, not because he was the oldest, Jin held that title, but because Big Hit recognized that Namjoon's combination of intelligence, emotional awareness, communication skills, and sheer force of will made him the only viable choice to hold this group together. You've just heard about a genius who burned down his own guaranteed future and led a group through chaos with nothing but willpower and words. Powerful stuff. But number 3 on this list hits a different nerve entirely, because the next member's struggle wasn't about what they chose to give up. It was about something they were forced to hide, a part of their story so deeply buried that even standing on the debut stage, they were carrying a secret the cameras never caught. Don't go anywhere. Number 3 V, the invisible member who was never supposed to exist in BTS at all. There is no version of this story that doesn't sound like fiction. Absolutely none. Because what happened to Kim Taehyung, the person the world now knows as V, the man whose face has been called the most handsome on the planet by plastic surgeons, fashion designers, and international media outlets alike, defies every logical framework of how someone ends up in the biggest music group in human history. He wasn't scouted. He wasn't recruited. He didn't spend years dreaming of becoming an idol, meticulously preparing audition tapes, or begging his parents to let him move to Seoul. Kim Taehyung walked into Big Hit Entertainment's audition to support a friend. He was there as a spectator, a cheerleader, moral support. He had zero intention of stepping in front of the judges himself. And then a single Big Hit staff member, one person, one set of eyes, one spontaneous decision, looked at this random teenager standing in the hallway and said, "Why don't you audition too?" That question, asked almost casually in a corridor that probably smelled like cheap floor cleaner and nervous sweat, altered the trajectory of global pop music. If that staff member had been looking at their phone instead of scanning the crowd, if they'd been assigned to a different hallway, if Taehyung's friend had decided to audition on a different day at a different time, V would not exist. BTS as we know it would not exist. The butterfly effect of that single interaction is so absurdly improbable that it almost feels like the universe was running a specific script. But before we get deeper into what happened inside those audition walls, we need to talk about where Taehyung came from because his origin story is radically different from every other BTS member. And it's essential to understanding why his pre-debut struggle carries a flavor of isolation that the others, despite their own painful journeys, never quite experienced. Taehyung wasn't a city kid. While most BTS members came from metropolitan areas Busan, Daegu, Gwangju, Ilsan, Taehyung spent formative years of his childhood in Jeocheon County, a rural farming community in South Gyeongsang Province that most South Koreans would struggle to locate on a map without squinting. We're not talking about a small town with a charming downtown and local coffee shops. Jeocheon is agricultural land, rice paddies, fruit orchards, mountains, and the kind of deep countryside silence that makes a Seoul traffic jam sound like another planet. Taehyung's family were farmers. His grandparents, who played an enormous role in raising him, worked the land. The family's economic situation wasn't just modest, it was genuinely difficult. Money was tight in the way that rural agricultural families across the developing and developed world understand intimately. You're not starving, but there's no cushion, no margin for error. And definitely no discretionary budget for your grandson's artistic ambitions. Taehyung has spoken, often in fragments and through the coded language that Korean celebrities use when discussing family hardship, about growing up aware that his family worked incredibly hard for very little financial return. He's described childhood memories not of toys and trips, but of fields, of his grandparents' hands, of a simplicity that was beautiful but also limiting. The cultural gap between Jeocheon and Seoul isn't just geographic, it's atmospheric. Moving from a farming village to the capital of South Korea is like stepping through a portal into a different civilization. The speed, the noise, the competition, the social codes, the fashion, the expectations, everything operates on a wavelength that rural kids aren't tuned into, and the adjustment process can be brutally disorienting. Now layer onto that adjustment the fact that Taehyung didn't even plan to be there. He didn't arrive in Seoul with months of mental preparation, with a carefully rehearsed audition piece, with a family behind him saying, "Go chase your dream." He stumbled into an audition on a whim, impressed the judges with raw, untrained potential, and suddenly found himself catapulted into a trainee system he hadn't researched, hadn't prepared for, and didn't fully understand. The other trainees, Namjoon, Yoongi, Hoseok, the members who'd been grinding for months or years, had context. They understood the rules, the hierarchy, the expectations. Taehyung was learning the game while already playing it, and the learning curve was nearly vertical. But here's where V's story takes a turn that separates it from every other BTS pre-debut narrative, and it's the element that makes his struggle uniquely painful in a way that's hard to fully convey without sitting with it for a moment. Big Hit Entertainment made a deliberate, strategic decision to keep Kim Taehyung a secret. While the other BTS members were being gradually introduced to the public through pre-debut content, blog posts, photos, cover videos, social media interactions that allowed them to build small but passionate fan bases before the group even officially launched, Taehyung was hidden. Completely. He existed within the trainee system, practiced the same hours, learned the same choreography, lived in the same cramped dormitory, but to the outside world, he was a ghost. His face didn't appear on Big Hit's social media. His name wasn't mentioned in any pre-debut promotional material. While fans were already forming attachments to RM's lyricism, Suga's intensity, J-Hope's energy, Jin's visuals, Jimin's dance, and Jungkook's all-around talent, Taehyung occupied a void of non-existence. The company's reasoning was strategic. They wanted a surprise reveal close to debut to generate buzz and curiosity. From a marketing standpoint, it was a clever move. From a human standpoint, it was psychologically devastating for a teenage boy who was already struggling with imposter syndrome. Imagine training side by side with 6 other people every single day, pouring the same sweat, enduring the same exhaustion, sharing the same dream, and then watching all of them get acknowledged, celebrated, and discussed by a growing online fan base while you're told to stay invisible. You can't post about your experiences. You can't share your progress. You can't connect with the fans who are already choosing their favorites among your group mates. You exist in a strange purgatory where you're simultaneously a member of the team and a non-entity to the audience. The psychological impact of that enforced invisibility on a teenager, particularly one who'd already grown up feeling geographically and economically on the margins, cannot be overstated. Taehyung has never explicitly used the word invisible to describe this period, but the emotional residue is traceable in interviews where he's discussed feeling uncertain about his place in the group, wondering if the company's decision to hide him meant they were unsure about keeping him, or if his role was somehow less important than the others. That insecurity didn't come from nowhere. It was systematically cultivated by a marketing strategy that treated his existence as a reveal rather than a reality. When V was finally unveiled to the public, mere days before BTS's official debut on June 13, 2013, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Fans who had already mapped out the group's dynamics suddenly had to recalibrate. Who is this person? Where did he come from? Why was he hidden? The mystery worked commercially, but it also meant Taehyung debuted without any of the pre-built fan relationships his members had been nurturing for months. He was starting from zero in a race where everyone else had a head start, and the pressure to prove himself worthy of the spot he suddenly occupied was immense. And beyond the marketing isolation, there's another layer to Taehyung's struggle that often gets overlooked because of how effortlessly cool and artistic he appears now. V's personality, his deep, contemplative, unconventional way of thinking and expressing himself, didn't fit neatly into the boxes that the K-pop trainee system was designed to produce. He was quirky in ways that confused people. He said things that didn't follow conventional conversational patterns. His artistic sensibilities leaned toward jazz, classical music, and fine art in an environment that was laser-focused on pop hooks and hip-hop beats. In a system that rewards conformity and predictability, Taehyung's natural wiring was almost counterproductive. Early interviews show a Taehyung who's clearly trying to modulate himself to fit into the expected idol mold, and you can feel the tension between who he naturally is and who the industry was asking him to be. That tension, the effort of constantly self-editing your personality so you don't stick out too much, don't seem too weird, don't give the company a reason to reconsider your position, is emotionally exhausting in a way that doesn't leave visible scars, but absolutely leaves internal ones. He wasn't fighting the obvious battles of poverty or family disapproval, though financial hardship was certainly part of his background. He was fighting the quieter, more insidious battle of feeling fundamentally different from his environment and not knowing whether that difference was his greatest strength or the thing that would ultimately disqualify him. Years later, of course, that difference became the very thing that made V iconic. Number 2, J-Hope, the sunshine who almost walked away and left BTS forever. There's an unwritten rule in every group, every team, every family. Someone has to be the light. Someone has to walk into the room and make the air feel breathable when the pressure is crushing everyone's lungs. In BTS, that person has always been young Hoseok. J-Hope, the eternal mood maker. The guy whose energy could resurrect a dead practice room at 3 a.m. The human exclamation point who screams, dances, laughs, and radiates so much positivity that fans gave him the nickname Sunshine, and it stuck because it was genuinely, undeniably accurate. But here's the thing about Sunshine that people rarely stop to consider. The sun itself is on fire. It burns constantly, violently, endlessly, and nobody ever asks the sun if it's tired of burning. Nobody asks if the sun wants a day off. And for years, nobody asked young Hoseok what was really going on behind that megawatt smile, that explosive energy, that relentless commitment to being everyone else's source of hope. Because the truth, the real, documented, verified truth that shook the BTS fandom when it fully came to light is that J-Hope, the hope of BTS, almost quit the group entirely. Not thought about it casually one afternoon, almost quit. Not had a passing moment of doubt, almost quit. He was actively preparing to leave. Bags were mentally packed. The decision was all but finalized. The person who would eventually become one of the most dynamic performers in modern music history was walking toward the exit door, and BTS came within a razor's edge of losing him before the world ever got to see what he could do. To understand how Hoseok reached that breaking point, you have to understand where he came from and what he sacrificed to be in that building in the first place. Hoseok grew up in Gwangju, a city in the southwest of South Korea that carries enormous cultural and historical significance. It's the city of the 1980 Gwangju Uprising, a cornerstone of South Korea's democracy movement. And that spirit of resilience and artistic expression runs deep in the city's DNA. It was in Gwangju that young Hoseok discovered dance, not idol choreography, not studio-polished routines, but raw, kinetic, street-born dance that lived and breathed in underground studios, local competitions, and open-air performances where the only judge that mattered was the crowd's reaction. Hoseok wasn't just a dancer. He was a phenomenon. As a member of a street dance crew called Near-elimination, he competed in regional and national dance battles with a ferocity and technical precision that made audiences forget they were watching a teenager. In 2008, he placed first in a national dance competition, a win that cemented his reputation in South Korea's underground dance community as one of the most gifted young performers in the country. This wasn't some school talent show trophy. This was a nationally recognized title in a fiercely competitive scene where hundreds of dedicated dancers battled for recognition. By his early teens, Hoseok had already built something most aspiring artists spend their entire lives chasing, a legitimate, earned reputation. He was known, respected. His path as a professional dancer, choreographer, or dance instructor was as clear as Namjoon's academic trajectory. Gwangju's dance community saw him as their prodigy, their future, the kid who was going to put their city's dance scene on the national map. And then he left all of it behind. When Big Hit Entertainment came calling, Hoseok faced a calculation that mirrors Namjoon's sacrifice in structure but differs profoundly in texture. Namjoon gave up academic certainty. Hoseok gave up artistic identity. He wasn't just leaving Gwangju, he was leaving a version of himself that he'd spent years constructing, a version that had already been validated by victories, by peer respect, by the kind of concrete evidence that says you belong here. You're already succeeding. Trading that for a trainee slot at a small, financially precarious entertainment company wasn't just risky. It was, from the perspective of his dance community, borderline incomprehensible. Street dancers and underground performers in Korea viewed the idol industry with the same skepticism that underground rappers did as a manufactured, commercialized machine that stripped away artistic authenticity and replaced it with corporate packaging. For Hoseok to enter that machine voluntarily was, in the eyes of some peers, a betrayal of the culture that raised him. But Hoseok made the leap. He moved to Seoul, entered Big Hit's trainee system, and almost immediately slammed into a wall he hadn't anticipated. See, here's what the audition process hadn't fully prepared him for. Big Hit didn't just want a dancer. They wanted a complete idol. And complete in the pre-debut BTS context meant you had to rap, sing, and perform with the camera, not just dominate a dance floor. Hoseok was brought in primarily for his dance ability. That was his ticket through the door. But once inside, the expectations expanded rapidly and mercilessly. He was told to rap. Not casually, not as a secondary skill, but to develop into a legitimate rapper capable of holding his own alongside RM and Suga, two of the most technically skilled underground rappers of their generation. Imagine that for a second. You've spent your entire young life mastering one art form. You've achieved national recognition in it. And now you're being told that your mastery isn't enough, that you need to also become proficient in an entirely different discipline, one that the two guys standing next to you have been honing since before you even considered this career path. RM had been writing lyrics and studying rap architecture for years. Suga had survived Taegu's underground scene and produced his own beats. And Hoseok was supposed to step into the same arena and compete? The skill gap wasn't just noticeable, it felt insurmountable. Every rap evaluation became an exercise in humiliation. Every recording session highlighted the distance between where he was and where the company needed him to be. Hoseok has spoken about this period with a vulnerability that cuts through his usual bright demeanor, the feeling of being genuinely inadequate, of questioning whether he had any business trying to be something he clearly wasn't trained for. He could outdance anyone in that building without breaking a sweat, but the moment a microphone was placed in his hand and he was asked to deliver bars with the conviction and technical control of a natural rapper, the confidence evaporated. And this is where the psychological complexity of Hoseok's struggle reveals itself in layers that most surface-level tellings of his story miss entirely. The persona of J-Hope, the boundlessly positive, always smiling, energy-infusing role he plays within BTS, wasn't something that emerged naturally from a person who was internally at peace. It was a construction. A deliberate, conscious decision to present a version of himself that the group needed, regardless of how he actually felt inside. Hoseok has admitted, most notably in the Burn the Stage documentary series and in candid group interviews, that maintaining the Hope persona was emotionally draining in ways that are difficult to articulate. When you're the designated mood maker, there's an unspoken contract. You don't get to have bad days. You don't get to walk into the practice room with slumped shoulders and dead eyes. You don't get to sit in the corner and be quietly miserable, because the moment you stop radiating energy, the entire group's emotional ecosystem destabilizes. Everyone else is allowed to struggle visibly. The leader carries strategic weight. The vocalists carry performance pressure. The youngest carries the burden of growing up too fast. But the sunshine? The sunshine just has to shine, endlessly, without interruption, without complaint, without anyone ever asking what happens when the batteries run out. And Hoseok's batteries were running out. The combination of identity crisis, dancer forced into rapper territory, imposter syndrome, the exhaustion of emotional performance, and the broader pressures of trainee life pushed him to a threshold that he crossed quietly, without fanfare. Number 1 Jimin, the man who was told his only value was his face and spent years proving an entire industry wrong. Every countdown has a summit. Every list, if it's built right, saves the one story that reframes everything you thought you understood about the subject. And this is that story. Because when you think of BTS members struggling before fame, your mind probably goes to poverty, underground rap battles, childhood sacrifice, hidden identities, or near departures. Those are dramatic, visible, narratively satisfying struggles with clear villains and clear resolutions. But the struggle that sits at number 1 on this list is different. It's quieter, slower, more corrosive. It's the kind of battle that doesn't announce itself with a single catastrophic moment, but instead erodes you from the inside out, day after day, practice session after practice session, evaluation after evaluation, until you're standing in front of a mirror wondering if the person looking back at you is a fraud who somehow conned his way into a room full of people who actually belong there. This is the story of Kim Seokjin, the eldest. The one who walked into big hit entertainment with absolutely nothing, no musical training, no dance background, no vocal lessons, no performance experience, no underground credibility, no childhood spent preparing for this moment, and was told, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that his only contribution to this group was the symmetry of his face. Rewind to 2011, and let's set the scene with a detail so cinematically absurd that it sounds like something a screenwriter would reject for being too on the nose. Kim Seokjin was a university student at Konkuk University in Seoul, enrolled in the Department of Film and Visual Arts. His dream wasn't music. It wasn't performance. It was acting. He wanted to be on screen, studying the craft of film, analyzing scripts, learning camera techniques, quietly building a career in an industry adjacent to K-pop, but fundamentally different in its demands and culture. He was walking to class one day, literally walking down a street, backpack on, headphones in, completely unremarkable in his own daily routine, when a casting agent from Big Hit Entertainment spotted him. And stopped. And stared. The agent didn't hear Jimin sing, didn't watch him dance, didn't read his resume or review a portfolio of performances. The agent looked at Kim Seokjin's face and decided, in that moment, that this person needed to be in an entertainment company. That's how Jimin entered the world of K-pop. Not through years of preparation. Not through audition tapes polished over dozens of attempts. Not through underground credibility or dance competition trophies or academic brilliance repurposed for artistic ambition. He was street cast. Selected. Chosen for the genetic lottery, he happened to win. Broad shoulders, symmetrical features, the kind of classical Korean handsomeness that casting agents are trained to identify from across a crowded intersection. And from the very first day he stepped into Big Hit's training facility, that origin story became his curse. Because in a room full of prodigies, a rapper with a 148 IQ, an underground lyricist who'd survived Daegu's streets, a nationally awarded street dancer, a contemporary dance prodigy admitted as the top student in his department, a multi-talented teenager who'd been recruited by 7 companies, and even an accidental auditionee with raw natural charisma, Kim Seokjin was the one who had nothing to offer except the geometry of his bone structure. And everyone knew it, including him. The skill gap between Jimin and the other trainees wasn't a gap, it was a canyon. A canyon so vast that bridging it seemed less like a challenge and more like a physical impossibility. RM had been rapping for years. Suga could produce, write, and perform in his sleep. J-Hope's body moved in ways that defied anatomical logic. Jimin was a classically trained dancer with professional-grade technique. Jungkook, despite being the youngest, was a natural-born performer who absorbed skills like a sponge absorbs water. And V, even with his unconventional entry, possessed raw vocal talent and an innate stage presence that couldn't be taught. Jimin had none of that. Not a single applicable skill. He couldn't dance, and in K-pop, where choreography is as essential as breathing, that wasn't just a weakness, it was an existential liability. He hadn't trained his voice, his singing was untested, undeveloped, the vocal equivalent of a blank canvas in a room full of finished paintings. He didn't know how to move on stage, how to hold a microphone with authority, how to project emotion through performance rather than through a camera lens and a script. He was, by every measurable metric the trainee system used to evaluate potential, the least qualified person in the room. And the system made sure he felt it. Every evaluation, every monthly assessment where trainees performed in front of company executives and received feedback became an exercise in public inadequacy for Jimin. While other members received critiques about refinement, tighten this flow, add more power to that note, clean up the footwork in the second verse, Jimin received critiques about fundamentals. Basic rhythm. Basic pitch. So there it is. 7 members. 7 struggles. 7 stories that most fans only know the surface of, and that most casual observers have never heard at all. But when you pull back and look at these 7 narratives together, not as isolated tales of individual hardship, but as interconnected chapters of a single, larger story, something remarkable emerges. Something that explains not just how BTS became the biggest group in the world, but why their connection with fans runs so impossibly deep. Jimin, number 7, was the last one in the door, fighting every day to prove he deserved to stay while starving himself into collapse because the industry told him his body wasn't right. Suga, number 6, was a broke underground rapper from Daegu who had a car accident injury because he couldn't afford to heal and entered an idol system that violated everything his artistic community stood for. Jungkook, number 5, was a 13-year-old child who traded his entire adolescence for a dream he couldn't fully comprehend, crying himself to sleep in a dormitory hundreds of kilometers from the only family he'd ever known. RM, number 4, was a certified genius who burned down a guaranteed future, endured mockery from his own artistic peers, and shouldered the impossible weight of leading a group through chaos while barely old enough to vote. V, number 3, was a farm kid who never even meant to audition, got hidden from the public like a secret the company wasn't sure it wanted to reveal, and spent his trainee days wondering if his very presence was a mistake. J-Hope, number 2, was a nationally recognized dance champion who was told that being the best dancer in the room wasn't enough, who battled crippling self-doubt behind a constructed mask of sunshine, and who came within inches of walking away from BTS forever. And Jimin, number 1, was a university student with 0 musical training who was cast for his face, labeled just a visual, and spent years in the shadows of more naturally gifted members, outworking the gap through sheer willpower until the label no longer fit. 7 completely different backgrounds. 7 completely different pain points. A farmer's grandson and a genius's son. An underground rap veteran and a kid who didn't know what a trainee was. A street dance champion and a contemporary dance prodigy. A boy who was hidden and a man who wished he could hide. And yet, somehow, these 7 wildly different human beings found each other in a cramped practice room of a company that was one failed album away from bankruptcy, and they held on. To each other. To the dream. To the belief that what they were building was worth every tear, every skipped meal, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. That's the part of BTS's story that no chart position, no stadium sellout, no Billboard record can fully capture. The music is extraordinary. The performances are legendary. The commercial achievements are historically unprecedented. But the foundation, the thing that makes 300 million fans across the planet feel a genuine, almost spiritual connection to these 7 men, is the struggle. It's knowing that Dynamite was sung by a voice that almost quit. That Butter was performed by feet that once couldn't keep rhythm. That Boy with Love was written by hands that once chose kimbap over bus fare. That Spring Day, a song about longing and loss, was created by 7 people who understand longing and loss not as abstract lyrical concepts, but as lived, daily realities that nearly broke them before the world ever learned their names. BTS didn't become famous despite their struggles. They became legendary because of them. Every hardship sharpened their artistry. Every sacrifice deepened their bond. Every moment of doubt made the eventual triumph taste sweeter, not just for them, but for every fan who sees their own invisible battles reflected in these 7 stories. So the next time someone asks you, why BTS? What makes them different from every other group? Now you have the answer. It was never just about the music. It was about 7 boys who had every reason to stop and not a single reason that was strong enough to make them. And that is something no algorithm, no marketing budget, and no industry machine can manufacture. That's real. That's BTS. Thanks for watching. If these stories moved you, share them with someone who needs to hear that struggle isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of one. Until next time.